Okay, great. So I would firstly like to thank you all for inviting me for your exciting event. It's a pleasure to be here and meet and see you all, although virtually. Thank you for allowing me to share my experience in architecture and academia in particular, and my way to the Venice Biennale exhibition. I would firstly like to start with a short introduction of myself, and I'm going to show you some of my illustration and drawings later on. So to begin with, I am a third-year architecture student at London South Bank University, and a student rep there, also an organizer of its recently formed architectural society. And I'm originally from Bulgaria. It was in the beginning of my second year, I guess, at university, when I started to think about the identity of my work and how recognizable it is among my tutors, teachers, and colleagues, and what's kind of the message I want to pass and what characteristic it holds. So I have summarized here on that page the outcomes of a 2-month-long investigation of my personality, looking at my roots and tracing back where I come from to identify firstly who I am and then my interests and what I'm going to pursue in architecture. So I've just shown a map in Bulgaria where I come from and some places that I wanted to portray and places that I felt emotionally connected to. And they all had one thing in common, which was the protagonists within them. I'll just zoom in so you're able to see those hand drawings. So yeah, it was also the story behind every space I wanted to illustrate that's kind of representing me as well. It was either the people in there or the animals or even some objects going into more kind of a ritualistic aspect where, for example, there was a book in a church where it was believed that if you write down your wish, it will shortly become true. So the more I was diving into the process of creating a space and the process of placemaking, the more I was realizing that without its inhabitants and the atmospheres they create, a building would be just a dead structure, or speaking of a larger scale, a city would be an empty field in terms of life and experiences. So having started my second project at university, I was experiencing also my sites within psychogeographics maps to understand spaces, people, its sensory experiences or emotions of the environment. It involved also talking to people, and particularly the owners of leather shops in Brick Lane, which was my site, to understand their narratives and stories, where they come from and why are they settled in Brick Lane. And my proposal actually here involved proposing a building which would be seen as a revival of crafts in Brick Lane, since some of them had already been dead, like the weaving industry. Yeah, my approach and concept were inspired by the history of the site and the weavers' neighborhood, where each building provided a certain piece of clothing. And thus calling my project Craft Town, and my center was a micro village aimed towards creative practices where users can benefit from both communal and private spaces in which they can live and work. And they could also be able to customize their space using kinetic time-based architectural elements. And by that time, I was also thinking about representation of my drawings and ideas with various mediums, starting from some basic models made out of paper or thread, because it was time of the first lockdown in London. So I didn't have that much access to different materials or professionally cut or laser cut models, let's say. So yeah, I was experimenting with those, or quick sketches that then transformed to more precisely drawn digital drawings, or also digital models. And at this point, I have to mention that I came to Arinjoy's profile on Instagram and his drawings, which were my inspiration for graphical representation. And I was really interested in the detailed drawings and atmospheres that were created. So I was trying to experiment it in my own and create similar atmospheres by firstly modeling them in Rhino, let's say, and then finishing them in Illustrator and Photoshop. So yeah, with my final views of that Craft Town Communal Centre, which I've shown here, I got nominated for the RIBA London Student Awards, and the Craft Centre was also featured in the Zine's virtual show last year. But the most kind of exciting accomplishment, though, was taking the second winner place in the RIBA Eye Line competition last summer and being included in the August issue magazine. Lastly but not least, my university selected that project to be exhibited in the Venice Biennale exhibition to celebrate its complexity, message and appreciation. And I'm currently working on a physical model which would be represented there, and the event would be open from May to November this year. So if someone heads towards Venice, you'll be free to welcome to enter, sorry. This year I have continued to explore stories and narratives behind civic buildings, and I've just included some more illustrations of my work, but in this one on the right here, I was trying to illustrate my research in Chinese culture, and it's almost lost unpublished stories, along with the unfulfilled capacity of the Tianjin Binhai Library, which was a recently built project by MVRDV. So I've shown kind of an axonometric section on the right of it. And its story is that the library is only allowing foreign literature to be kind of collected within its central area, and then it's restricted to just national books being stored. So it's just 1/6 of it being filled with books, and then you enter an empty space with some digital technologies, which hopefully make up for the lost stories. So my proposal included going back to the community and the population, looking at its culture and collecting those into published or digitally published books that would help the library become a truly civic center. Yeah, going to some more civic experiences. I was imagining the future civic building where it's more of a democratized process of voting, and where kind of the population invades into a parliament and sends reaction. It has its own voice heard by the politicians. It's not just them making decisions and then announcing them, but it's more of a truly democratic space. Here, I'm not sure about the resolution on the screen, but I was again looking at civicness and how it started with stories being told around the fire in nature, and going to some more architectural elements envisaged in the future as well, with some digital technologies and elements and digital realities and virtual ones. This year, the stories behind my projects include those from the financial world in the City of London, having it as my site. And I was investigating the people, starting from the protagonists always, and how it's all about artists surrounded by churches in a Gothical architectural style. So I was aiming to propose a center where I am again having a revival of architecture of the site, but then my protagonists can recognize themselves in, and they're fully open to the public, because nowadays if you don't have a friend from that financial industry, it's really hard to understand their world, their experiences and values, and it's really little information being published online or wherever that you could take a glimpse of that sector. So yeah, I was also interested in the constantly changing environments in the financial markets, and having Brexit as an issue or a scenario, and looking at two scenarios of a dystopian and a utopian one, where it either flourishes or is left empty and destroyed after everyone leaves the City of London. But I decided to go for the utopian one and see the future of the city in a positive way. So I created a fragment which speaks a narrative of the financial world, and encourages more humanistic approach to clients in the banking industry, having different rates in terms of how you've dealt with the client today, or what's your behavior towards those people that go to the financial institutions. And it's just a view here within that mechanism, which was an analog one, taking into account a possible emergency of a cyber attack where information is lost. I'll finish with a concept collage where the last project of mine was illustrated, kind of collecting protagonists, programs and buildings from around the site into one single proposal, where the public is able to go in and understand and experience, having different routes and ritualistic approaches to anything that's happening around the city, but it's really close between those walls in the financial institutions. And I also have St. Paul's Cathedral as a sign, a symbol of religion or faith, to kind of represent within my proposal what bankers believe in, and to show it to the public as well. So if they can't really go to the churches because they're not Christian, for example, they could come to mine and express their own values and in their own way. So I think that's the end of my short presentation, and I would like to say thank you to all for your attention. And if you were to take just one thing from my presentation today, I would like it to be to engage with the message you aim to pass from with your projects or drawings or illustrations, and remember the story you are aiming to tell to the public or whoever the viewer of your illustration is. Thank you.
That was so great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mimi, do you think we should go on to the next presentation and take questions after, or?
I guess if anyone has any immediate questions that they would like to ask, please pipe up now. Yes, go for it.
That was lovely. That was such a lovely presentation. And before I ask my question, I would just say that I'm truly, truly humbled that some of my work has been able to kind of provide some precedents for your work. Because when I saw your RIBA J entry, I was just really astounded by how good they were and how nice it was. So I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. And having to know that, like coming to know that, like there was something that perhaps my work has inspired you. That was it's truly very humbling.
Thank you.
But the question that I had was, so have you started your master's yet, or are you still
No, I'm
on
doing
it?
my third year.
Oh wow, that is a lot of work for third year. But my question was, how did you move from, let's say, one theme or interest to another, like themes, and how like the technique or the representation changed from
Okay.
one project to another?
Well, the first project I showed was from my second year with the RIBA competition, and then the financial one is from my third year. So currently I'm working on that one. But yeah, I was always striving for illustrating some details of those atmospheres, and I wasn't really comfortable with collages, taking different photographs and messing them up together. I was striving for something more complex, and I always feel that if I'm working on a collage, I'm not giving my best, because those illustrations with line drawings and then Photoshop, etc., it takes a lot of time, at least 3 days for me. I don't know about you. So I'm really feeling that I'm giving my best, while if it's a bit quicker, then I'm feeling guilty of not kind of spending more time on a certain piece. But yeah, I was really inspired by yours and other people from your unit, and how you collect those information in a single line drawing and then start working on that. And yeah, thank you again for inspiring me.
But well, thank you so much. I was gonna ask that, how did, let's say, the kind of way you've represented your second year project, and there's a distinct move from there to your third year project, where you're talking about Hong Kong and the financial institutions. So what kind of, was there anything that made you kind of take that leap from one kind of methodology or process or kind of technique style to another one?
I guess it's firstly the brief we were given in university. So it depends what's your brief and what's your task in developing your narrative. And then having been given the brief of research in civic buildings, and we had the options of choosing some of them. I chose the library as something appropriate to look back to the stories behind it and the concepts. The other ones, I mean, the options were more generic, more modern architecture, and I didn't really see any kind of visible narrative behind. While here we had some concepts of see and be seen, or representing basically its couch, and the stepping it has in its interior represents the rice fields in the natural typologies of China. So I thought I could go back and look at their stories and yeah, the culture. Hope it
That's
makes
lovely.
sense.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
it does. It's really lovely, and I am kind of really astounded that you're still in your undergrad. So I think it's absolutely amazing, like the
Thank you.
what you've accomplished.
Thanks very much.
Also, maybe just a quick question. I was wondering, do you feel like maybe you're really interested in the political side of architecture, from what I've noticed? Do you have to do a lot of research beforehand, or do you just regularly follow them? Or
I think I really research it in depth. I was reading a lot before starting any project, because I aim to be as informed as possible before I start doing anything, because I need to have my arguments why I'm doing that and not this. And yeah, I need to take in the information first and then represent it and analyze it, then transform it in any illustration later on.
that's great, thank you.
Thank you.
Then, any other questions? Pressing questions? Then, guess not.
Yeah, I completely back that. I think that's an incredible amount to have done for your part one, let alone prior to finishing. So I think, yeah, lots of beautiful work. And I'm also just aware of time. If please, if you do have any questions, either type it into the chat box, or you put a Q, and then we'll come to you to verbally say your question. But yeah, maybe if you hop on to the next one, if you'd like to present yourself first, give a bit of background of like where you are, and
Yes,
accumulate all the questions at the end as well.
Yeah. So I'm currently in London, and I'm in my final year of masters at the Bartlett, and I'm originally from India. And I came here about 6 years back. I did my undergrad in Manchester, I can't even begin, like, I can't even believe like what I had done in like secondary in comparison. Like, I don't even want to think about it. Like, so, but now, and I did my 2 year out in Liverpool. So now I'm just, yeah, final year, London, Bartlett. And I think what I am interested in researching will kind of come out or emerge from the presentation and what I talk about it. But yeah, I'll just get on with it now. Can you present just a window, or do you have to present the entire screen?
I think it's the entire screen. I'm new to Google Teams, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
So in the bottom right hand corner, it says present now, and hopefully you've got 3 options to do: entire screen, a window, or a tab. And if you don't, because you're not a Sheffield member,
No, I
I'm not
don't.
sure.
I just have one option. I'll just see whether there's any other option there. No, it's just my entire screen. 1 second. Just 1 second.
I think it might be the little bit of a difference between having a student account and then like a guest account.
Yeah, I guess so. Just 1 second, because I had some presentation notes on my screen and I divided the screen. So I'll just take it on my phone and I'll start kind of presenting the whole screen then. I don't mind doing that.
Okay. Please take away with any questions. That's what we're here for, to answer them, hopefully. So put them in the chat at the end or during the talk, should you come up with any. Lovely.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Right. So today I'm going to be talking about my work through the lens of one of the crucial themes underlying the development of my work, methodology, and thought process, which is identity. And this notion of identity started emerging as an important concept as I started exploring the political side of architecture and the notion of spatial agency. This again was less of a conscious or strategic move and more of an emergence from the contexts and issues that I was interested in addressing. Now, I'll start off with a project that I completed last year, Productive Insurgence. And a part of this project was my entry for the RIBA Eye Line, RIBA J Eye Line. Now, as a brief introduction to the project, sorry, can you see me scrolling down? Or is it stuck on the same screen?
It is some photographs of people and communities.
All right, brilliant. So you can see me scrolling down. Brilliant. Right. As a brief introduction to the project, Productive Insurgence aimed to address the highly conflicted state of Indian-occupied Kashmir at the India-Pakistan border. This was in light of the events that had taken place right before the inception of the project. Very briefly, basically, Kashmir had enjoyed a special semi-autonomous status in India owing to the complexity of the partition of India during its independence. Now, this status was taken away from them, bringing the state of Kashmir right under the rule of the central kind of Indian government under highly dubious and oppressive circumstances. But even historically, Kashmir has always been a highly contested landscape and therefore one of the most militarized regions in the world. Now, as a starting point to the project, I started with this kind of conceptual drawing or representation of Kashmir, and you'll be able to see that there is a wall which surrounds a certain territory or cuts across this territory. And this is essentially a representation of this epithet, paradise on earth, essentially a tagline that was used to describe Kashmir because of its natural beauty. Now, the idea of the wall came from essentially the idea of paradise, because in the early conceptions of the term paradise, it came from the idea of this walled entity, a walled state of exception, where everything bad is outside of the walls, and whatever is inside, the state of exception, is a kind of a form of paradise. Now, from there, the project kind of aimed to address the highly oppressed state of the people in Kashmir and the entangled notion of biopolitics, identity politics, and production. It was a hopeful project trying to resist overt notions of utopia in an attempt to address some of the ground reality. Therefore, the project was at the same time within and against the state. This was done through the idea of, again, a state of exception. Now, which started off, as you can see here, as a walled garden and ended up being a productive commons network. Now, among the things mentioned, identity started emerging as a crucial concept within the development of the project. The drawings, the narrative, the process were all interwoven with the thread of identity, as this is something that the people were constantly having to negotiate. And so the starting point to this, to the exploration of identity, and to an extent the project itself, became the carpet. Now, as you'll see, the concept developed through the exploration of the medium of the carpet are applied throughout the drawings within the project. Firstly, the carpet as a cultural artifact was essential to the Kashmiri identity. Secondly, the carpet has an inherent narrative capacity. And thirdly, the carpet acted as a state of exception, as a bounded space within physical space. Therefore, the medium of the carpet here, used to project a developing incremental site plan, could be alternatively read as a manifesto, encapsulating certain identity narratives of the project, as well as it became a new medium for representation, as well, and and the material within the reality of the project. Now, the role of the architect within the project then also extended to that of the storyteller. The project became an apparatus for the telling of stories and for imbibing these stories within the architecture towards a new grammar for the city. The buildings almost acted as masks that were to be activated by the users and their stories. Similarly, the drawings, which you'll see following from here, aspired to do this as well. An incomplete artifact or process attempting to capture and hold narratives to be activated and read by the viewer. Now, the the role of constructing a narrative is divided between the painted image and the spatial typologies. Actually, I'll go back. The built infrastructure of the project employs hybrid spatial typologies as a means to construct a narrative rooted in place, where these spatial typologies are imagined to be characters within a narrative that develops over time, each having a story to tell that is rooted in the struggles of Kashmiris. Now, let's come to the painted image or the drawings of the project. These drawings were deeply rooted in the Mughal miniature paintings because of the deep historical roots shared by Kashmir with it, and borrows a lot of conceptual and representational elements from it as well. Now, firstly, the Mughal painting had a very significant role in the Mughal Empire, as it was considered to be an important historical document rather than a purely artistic device. Moreover, the painted image of the Mughal painting was considered to be this ideological plane wherein utopia was not conceived of as an unattainable future, but rather located in the present, interwoven with an idea of a future. It was used to depict um, a, very, uh, a very strategic point of view of the empire. Now, this was something that the project wanted to embody. Therefore, the images and drawings within the project were never imagined to be just a representational medium. The peculiarity of some of the drawings and the way they were composed or constructed gave rise to an alternate hybrid spatiality. This became an alternative manifestation of the spaces of the project, one which is stuck in a temporal dysfunction like that of the Mughal painting, where time was not constructed as a linear progression, but one without a beginning and an end. So the production of images were imagined to occur at the intersection of three events. Number one, the painting as a manual, where it acts as a communicative tool for an alternative representation of architecture, where architecture can be read, interpreted, and evolved. This was imagined within the reality of the project. Number two, the painting as an evolving artifact, where the image keeps evolving from its first conception by the architect through its continuous development. Thus, the painted image kept evolving with the development of the building through to its ruin. And number three, the manifestation of the project within the material existence of the image as seen by the viewer, that is us. Uh, Now, along with the images, each of the building characters had their own stories, stories rooted in the identities and struggles of the people. For example, here it's the fisherman. While developing this building, I was also writing its narrative, which you can see beside it, um, that aimed to capture within its kind of story or poem uh, which was inspired by folk stories of Kashmir, where the ritual tradition of storytelling is very important. And it tried to capture this narrative. And this narrative then allowed me to conceptualize the drawings and images that followed. Now, the space of the painted image attempts to encapsulate this, the narrative capacity of the project, and the new projected grammar for the city through its depiction of the interrelationship between craftsmanship, labor, knowledge, and tradition, both in its image and its material existence. The image evolving gradually alongside the evolution of the built project embodies not only a temporal dysfunction through the weaving of alternate realities, but also becomes a medium for the actualization um, of the material reality of the project. Therefore, the idea of utopia, either within the conception of the project or its embodiment in the painting, is no unattainable projection. Rather, it is interwoven with the present and extending infinitely. And this is essentially the same kind of this idea of an evolving artifact represented through the two versions of the same kind of drawing in process, let's say. Um, that's the end of the first project, but I will kind of quickly mention some of the other work that I've been doing, which have also kind of been underlying this idea of identity. And one of them was the commission for a cover design for the architectural review. And the theme of the issue was emerging architecture. And I had a lovely kind of back and forth conversation with the uh, architectural review people, and it was really lovely. And what they essentially wanted to explore were the entanglements and intersections of identities, because this issue had a lot of kind of emerging architects and architecture from around the world, and they had this idea of the cover being this kind of site of emergence, something that is almost becoming. And even here, uh, the role of identity played a very important role in conceptualizing the design for it. And finally, I'll just very briefly touch upon the project that I'm currently working on, and it explores the subaltern identity. Now, the concept of the subaltern is one that has emerged from fairly recent post-colonial studies, and it is meant to represent the peoples who are and have been among the most marginalized of communities, having been oppressed historically and even now. Now, the idea of addressing the subaltern Indian landscape came about through an exploration of what is human, um, and what is meant by that, what are the rights, conditions, and thresholds that define or blurs the boundaries of what is human. And this is where uh, the most marginalized communities of the subaltern, often living at the edges of society, come in. Here again, uh, identity takes a very important role, as it is through the spatial practices, cultural practices, rituals, and traditions that define the right to inhabit a place or land. It is identity that is inextricably linked to the idea of living in places such as borderlands. And it is identity and its related practices that allow for an argument towards restitution. And the project, therefore, explores spaces and spatial practices that allow for resisting oppression and dispossession and present an argument to challenge the authorities and the preconceived identities of the peoples to prove their right to live and inhabit. And even here, the role of the drawing becomes crucial in kind of depicting not only rituals, traditions, and spatial practices, but also depicting narrative, because that becomes essentially a very important medium to for the exposure of the, let's say, subaltern narrative. And I think that is the end of my presentation. It is slightly weird presenting in this. We have not done this before, but I hope it went all right.
It was really good. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed both of your presentations. I'm guessing we're gonna take some questions, but firstly, I'm gonna start with one. So I was wondering, you mentioned that sort of traditions and occupation allow for people to occupy the space. So could you talk a bit more about this in terms of vernacular architecture? It's something we're
So,
currently working on. So I'm just
that's brilliant. Uh, First of all, this is just something personal. I would say that uh, the idea, especially in the context that I'm working in, the idea of the word vernacular is something that is a very colonial kind of introduction or imposition. And so that is something that personally a term that I try to avoid because it is something that is often like this entire idea of what is vernacular is quite a complex kind of concept, which often leads to um, Eurocentric or colonial kind of preconceptions. But when you're looking from the point of view of the people, um, it isn't vernacular, let's say, right? To arguably. But from there, moving on to the rituals and practices, the kind of context that I am exploring. Of course, I did not talk too much or more in depth about the last project that I was working on, but it's there in both the projects, more so in the current one I'm working in. When there is a kind of community or groups of people who are living, who are extremely marginalized and who are constantly negotiating the risk of dispossession, let's say people living in borderlands, people living or immigrants, or people, not just immigrants, just people who are, let's say, indigenous or tribal, or people who've been living in a place for generations, yet they are not recognized. They are not recognized as someone who have, or a group of people who have the right to live there, because they are so marginalized. And in such a case, especially a kind of very dense foresty landscape that I am currently addressing, and it is also at the borderlands. It's being a reserved or a protected forest. The preconceptions of the people and the authorities are that the protected forest is for the endangered species of biodiversity, especially tigers. But what they are forgetting is that there has been a population um, living there for ages, for generations, for years. Historically, they've kind of developed in that context, and they have been living alongside, let's say, the present biodiversity, the animals and everything. What happens in such a case is the rituals and traditions and spatial practices of the people, um, that is something that kind of not only define their identity, but also define the way they use that land, they use that context. And essentially, that becomes a kind of argument for their right to occupy and inhabit that place. And these rituals, practices, traditions, these are reflected in the architectures as well, because it is reflected in the way and the materials they use, the way they construct things, the labor behind it, and the way they organize communities, spaces, everything is intrinsically connected to ritualistic practices and traditions, which we often, as urban people, don't recognize or don't see. And the more you kind of get into it, these kind of start emerging as very important concepts.
Hi, thank you very much. It was a great presentation, and
Thank you very
we're
much.
happy to know that I also took your illustrations as a reference last semester.
Thank you so much.
Talking about touching on what you just were talking about, when it comes to, especially now in lockdown, where we kind of like struggle to really like go visiting places, or as students anyways, when it comes to doing research from your desktop, how would you suggest that was the best kind of like ways to go around it, to go in depth into really looking in the way that the local people would look at these problems?
Well, that is okay. These are the kind of restrictions that we are living with, and you could almost imagine um, the research or the way you're looking at it, looking at a certain context through the lens of, let's say, your screen. So you have to just accept the fact that these are the limitations, right? And it is fine, because I can't go to I could not go to Kashmir last year. I could not go to my context this year, which is in Bengal, and these are places that I am not in the position to visit. But what I can do is try to understand as much as I can through what is available to me. A very important resource that people miss out is oral histories. We tend to look at very academic researches and very kind of technical reports and documents that are available to us, a very almost person point of view, or even like further than that. Um, but what is also available are two things. One is oral histories, interviews and stuff, and the other is um, narratives. So in such contexts, a lot of the times the stories, the myths, the epics, all of these kind of, if you kind of read them critically and go into it enough, what they reveal is the narratives of the people, how they live. It's all written there. It's all somehow hidden and encapsulated within the stories that, like, you might look at it as a folk tale, right? And we might read something as a story or a folk tale or blah, blah, blah. We'll concentrate on the plot. But the details that are hidden within it, they become crucial. Maybe a plant is mentioned, maybe an animal is mentioned, maybe the kind of, the way in which the tides work. They're all hidden and kind of within like the lines of the stories, essentially. Like for my research, I also read novels and oral histories that were and epics, poems. All of these things became an important part of let's say empirical research, because they were giving me insight into the way people are living in these conditions.
I think that's a great question and a really good answer. I'm also aware of time, and we've got some hands up and a question in the box. So if we start with Mariam and then we lead on to Anna, and I'm not sure if Samuel still has a question, but Mariam's question is, these are some lovely drawings, and I was wondering, how do you get the inspiration for such great complex drawings? So I think you've probably already covered it quite a lot with the way that you are talking about these oral histories, and the more that you study poems, literature, probably even songs, all of the stuff can help encapsulate a kind of culture that you might not personally be able to experience or have dialogue within. But is there any other specific inspiration that you might look for drawings?
Yes, and that is like other than the written and the oral stuff, there's also the visual elements, right? So for example, last year I really went into a deep exploration of the Mughal painting, right? And the conceptions behind it. That became really crucial. This year, I'm looking at scroll paintings, and they are like the context that I am kind of investigating this year. They had these things called Pottochitra, which is essentially Bengali scroll paintings, and they were kind of traditionally kind of created to kind of accompany performances, theatrical performances or oral recitations, and they just accompanied on the side, almost as a storyboard, right? Again, and a deep study or exploration into the visual mechanisms and visual mediums, devices that all communities in the world have at some point of time, in some way or the other, have used some sort of a visual medium to kind of tell stories or do something, right? And the like studying and understanding, not just looking at it superficially, but understanding these these visual mediums become really important as well. And in my work, I am not trying to merely replicate the medium. What I instead try to do is, because I am aware of my condition, ultimately I am not under any kind of misconception that my viewer are the Kashmiris or my viewer are the subaltern kind of tribal people. No, my viewers are you guys. My viewers are the people in university, right? That is something that I have to kind of accept. And that just allows me to move a bit further, right? I can learn from whatever I'm looking at and whatever I'm researching, but I can then move on to hybridize these mediums itself, and hybridize the way, essentially trying to look for, because they were not meant to be architectural representation, the mediums I am investigating, but what I am drawing myself in part, be it narrative, be it whatever, is also an architectural medium or a medium for architectural representation, right? So then I can start hybridizing those like that medium.
Great. Anna, I think you're next on your question.
Hey. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for a great talk there. I really enjoyed it. I guess one for both of you, really. Both of a lot of the work that you produce is really kind of graphically and visually engaging. What advice would you give to, say, younger students when they're kind of just starting out with experimenting with these kind of more digital canvases for expressing their ideas?
Desislava, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. So firstly, I really find it quite easier to start modeling digitally. You have the ability to go back editing. So it's not just like hand-drawn illustrations where whatever you've done can be changed. I mean, you can import it in Photoshop and do it, but yeah, it's always about learning and practicing, because at the first kind of experiments you might have which would be not working maybe. And I didn't like my work at the beginning, but then the more details you start adding, it's not just a plain illustration with a few columns if it's an architectural atmosphere, but you start adding its inhabitants, the people, which you know, their belongings, and then it starts to kind of form that detailed drawing that really speaks about experiences, emotions, and it translates those stories to the viewer, so you can really interpret. Even the colors speak about the mood you or your inhabitants in the picture have, or the materials you're using, shadows even. So those really little elements make the difference for me.
What I would say is not contradictory to Desislava, but because she has already spoken about the technical aspects of it, what I would like to say is I do get a lot of questions of, let's say, what softwares you use and how do you do these drawings and blah, blah, blah. And that has its own place. Of course, that's the mechanical reproduction of drawings is also important. But to me, I would say that you have, and it's good to be kind of brave enough to not, you don't need to be brave. It's just good to be, just liberate yourself from softwares, like, or thinking about softwares. They are there to help you achieve what you want to achieve. You can't kind of be dictated by the software, right? The software, you can learn and use whatever you want. And they might kind of define to an extent the end result of your drawing. But I think when you're conceptualizing it, in the conceptual process, you can, or you should liberate yourself from what softwares are available to you, right? Rather focus more on what you are trying to show and what you're trying to, because I don't look at my drawings as illustrations. I look at themselves as something that goes hand in hand with the project. So a version of the project is inhabited within these drawings. This is ultimately how, like, the end manifestation of my project isn't going to be built, right? The project I'm doing here now. So what I have accepted and trying to use as an advantage is to kind of accept this and kind of rather treat the drawing as something that in which the project itself can be inhabited. So then you start incorporating things more than the building. Of course, the building will be there, the details will be there, which are super important. But at the same time, the other aspects of the project can slowly kind of come into it. And you can look at thousands of references. You don't have to, like, when I'm kind of doing a drawing, I don't look at one particular reference. I don't look at just Mughal paintings. I'm looking at Piranesi as well. I'm looking at European painters as well. I'm looking at different types of representation and trying to take in as much as I can and trying to kind of use a sort of a narrative, something that I'm trying to say, or something that the project is trying to say, trying to embody that within the drawing. And it can be a process. It doesn't have to be like, you know, you get it right the one time and that's done. It can keep on evolving through time. And that's about it. Yeah.
I think that was. Oh, sorry, Anna.
Yeah, I was just going to say that was a great answer. Thank you so much.
I think I did my undergrad elsewhere, but even at Sheffield, often schools get sort of encapsulated by a single drawing style. And I think often the school asks, like, how can we break this cycle? And you've pretty much answered that. It's project-specific design, and it's about telling what your building would be in life for a drawing. So I think you've answered that beautifully, and hopefully lots of people can take that away. Yara and Samuel in the question box also were asking the same question, so thank you very much to you both. I think we'll just finish off very quickly. We've got about 2 minutes left with Amy. She's popped her hand up. If you still have your question.
Hi, I just wanted to say, absolutely astounding drawings. They're really beautiful, and clearly, yeah, I mean, you kind of answered my question a bit. Like, clearly the magic of your drawings come from, both of you come from the narrative, but can you reveal like your mechanical drawing methods a little bit, if that's okay?
I could start
Yes.
with, thank you for your question. I really start with a basic sketch, like hand-drawn, really putting on paper what my thoughts are and what I want to show. And then I think about the software that I might achieve it better than the other one. So I basically start with Illustrator then, or if it's something more complex, I would model it in Rhino or SketchUp to capture some views, and then I would export them and go into a different software again, like Illustrator. I would edit the lines, line weights and types, colors. I would draw myself over my sketch, the people and the atmosphere. And finally, I usually go to Photoshop, where I tend to give it a bit more of a life in terms of color, some more shades, and yeah, that's my process of creating those.
So my process is, so I do start with very, is my video stuck? Sorry. Okay,
No.
fine. On my screen it is. Anyway, so my sketches, I do sometimes start with sketches, but the sketches are so scribbly, like they are literally scribbled. Like there is nothing, like barely anything decipherable from my sketches. But they are just a starting point for the idea of pen to paper, right? And then I try to work between drawing and modeling, because my drawing, like I try to kind of develop a hybrid spatiality within the drawings, and the peculiarity of the angles and the projections. They're not possible in a model, right? So even if I have a complete model, let's say the model is developing, right, over time, and it has, I've kind of come up with ended up with a pretty detailed model. I can't use that image or that kind of projection like immediately, because the oblique kind of views and angles and the mixture of things that I use, that can't really be generated in any kind of like 3D software, because they're so peculiar, right? The angles. So that becomes the model that has developed slowly, becomes a reference point. That just becomes a reference, because after that, I have to draw everything from scratch anyway. And I do draw everything from scratch. And I do this on, don't judge me, Vectorworks 2D. This is only, weirdly enough, I use it as, I don't know how, it's a BIM software. I have no idea how to use the BIM kind of capacities. I only use the 2D drawing surface, and I use it as an alternative to Illustrator. And the reason is because in my 2-year out, my practice was using Vectorworks 2D, right? And when I kind of transitioned to masters, I genuinely did not have time to, because that was the fastest way to do things for me, because I was already used to it so much. Even though I knew other softwares, this was the kind of easiest way. So what I do, you can easily kind of replicate it on Illustrator, on some other software. All of that is possible. I do it on Vectorworks. It's a bit more time consuming, and I like draw everything from scratch over there. And 90 to 95% of the drawing comes to life there itself. And Photoshop is there just for finishing touches, like absolute finishing touches, like some here and there, like but most of the drawing is completed on Vectorworks itself.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Vectorworks 2D is underrated as well. So.
Great. Well, I think you've offered a lot of advice. We've got a lot of first, second, even master students sitting here who have either beginning an approach to developing their design to a more complete level, or people are sitting on sort of rather stagnant representational tools looking for some inspiration. So you've definitely provided that, and more so how in which they can take it through, one technically, but also just in terms of that methodology and how it can really bring out the richness of the narrative, which Sheffield really tries to encourage, to have the strong narrative and everything behind. So thank you so much for both coming in, not so much for your very elegant and beautiful drawings, but also for your very eloquent way of talking and describing, which could be quite a daunting subject for many of us. So thank you for breaking it down into manageable chunks.
Well, thank you so much for having us. It was an absolute pleasure to be here. One last thing that I would say, because of what you said, is just that it might be good to just move or liberate yourself or try to move beyond uh, the idea of just representing a building. You know, we are so used to, like, throughout undergrad and throughout the practice and profession, our entire aim is to represent a very static building, right? In whatever ways, right? Be it drawing, be it render, be it whatever. And what might be helpful is to deconstruct that, right? Just say that that's not the only thing I want to represent. Like, I just don't want it to be a stagnant building. I want it to be more than that. And that could just be deconstructing. That could just be a starting point to your kind of methodology and the way you draw, and the answers are in the project. You don't, like, literally, like, I did not come across, I never did drawings like this before that, right? Before the projects, right? It all started and ended with the project. So I think just have faith in the project, and the project will give you the answers. But I know I talk way too much, and I apologize for it, but I really appreciate being invited here. Thank you so much for being lovely hosts.
Thank you for inviting us. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you very much for coming. It was great.
Thank you. Have a
Yeah.
lovely day, guys.
You
Bye.
too. Enjoy the sun in London, very
Bye.
jealous.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Thanks so much. Bye.